Well, good day, everyone. Welcome to another Faith Seeking Understanding. I am Allan Bevere, your host. I am a pastor, retired professor, Bible moth, theologian in exile, and I am a peddler of hope. And I am the self-appointed Anselm of Canterbury Chair of Podcast Theology and Culture at Faith Seeking Understanding University, a completely fabricated university, but a place where all seekers can ponder profound things free of charge. And on this month of Calmly Considered, I have the calm and considered Michael Cruz, who is the Grand Poobah Chair of Economics and Public Theology here at FSUU. And Michael, how are you doing today? And how are things in Kansas City?
I am doing wonderful. It's turning into summer weather here. It's a wonderful time of year. We're doing great.
Excellent, excellent. Hey, have you been following? I don't know. Do you follow the NBA at all? Are you following the finals?
No, I really haven't.
I got to tell you, I just have struggled to get into the NBA over the years. I like college basketball.
Oh, me too. Yeah.
I think college basketball is exciting. I think NBA is where exciting basketball goes to die.
Yeah.
I have struggled. You know, I did watch the playoffs the year that the Cavs won the championship with LeBron because I wanted to watch the playoffs. But man, I just have struggled to just get into the NBA. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just me. To me, it's like one step above watching golf.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just gotta say.
It just seems like running up and down the court, and there's 2 or 3 points every few seconds. There's very little strategy or excitement or drama in so much of it compared to college game.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I'm with you. But the good news is we're in baseball season, and
that's right.
You had posted some scenarios about the Royals being in a division where it's competitive because the teams there, including my own, we're rather good at losing.
Yes. Well, and I observed that in the American League East, you take the worst team in the American League East, put them in the Central Division, and they'd be tied for first place. So,
but it's still fun to watch.
The division is not doing real well.
It is fun. It is fun to watch. Yeah. Anyway, well, we just keep hoping and praying. I think sports fans are proof that there is something called hoping beyond hope.
That's right. That's right. Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get into our conversation today. Our conversation is deconstruction. This is a word we've heard a lot of late.
Yeah.
So let's just take the word. To what does it mean to deconstruct something? When you hear that word, Michael, how would you define to deconstruct anything? If construct is building, what is to deconstruct?
Wow. I think you're the philosopher. You would know better the formal definition than I would. But when I think of deconstructing, I think of looking at what's there, looking at its component pieces, and through some lens or multiple lenses, trying to discern the validity of those pieces that have put together the structure that I have. And so then by weighing that, I may learn that maybe my view, my perspective, my narrative that I've got together isn't complete, or maybe an error in places. And so therefore, maybe I need to change how I respond to the world and form a new and different narrative as to how things work. That's typically what I think of when I think of deconstructing. Is sort of an intentional effort to try to weigh what it is I believe and what I understand.
Yeah, that's good. That's good understanding. Let me kind of jump off on that. That deconstruction involves something that, first of all, is there. It has been constructed,
right?
And perhaps it has sat there for so long, we just accept it as basically true, right?
Exactly.
So we can construct, our faith, whatever that is. We build up our faith with scripture and with church teaching, et cetera, et cetera. And we just over time take it for granted that it's there. So, for example, for me, I grew up in a Christian home. I do not remember a time when my family didn't read devotions in the living room. I don't remember a time where we didn't go to church. I don't remember a time when I didn't go to Sunday school. And something in all of that was being constructed. And there wasn't a whole lot of questioning going on about that. But then when I got into college and began to really reflect on things, I did have to start to not necessarily tear the whole thing down, because in my case, I didn't deconstruct out of Christianity, but I had to kind of I had to peer into the windows a little more deeply of the building of my faith. I had to see what the furniture looked like, and I had to think whether I needed to rearrange it a little bit. And over the years, I've changed my mind about certain things of the Christian faith. I'm a Christian, but for example, just one thing I deconstructed was I was raised in a home where it was assumed that evolution was wrong, and that the world was 6,000 years old, and Adam and Eve were literally in the garden, and I no longer believe that. And in fact, I think that if you understand the doctrine of the Trinity, evolution makes perfect sense as to how God would create. All right. So I can deconstructed that. Now that didn't send me out of the faith like it does some people. But that's what I mean by deconstruction. Or, when I was younger, I was in favor of capital punishment in certain circumstances. I no longer am. I've changed my mind on that. So that's really what deconstruction is. When you're taking things that you have believed and you're scrutinizing them. You're saying, okay, is this something to hang on to or not? Or do I need to revise my views?
Right. Yeah. Hold fast to the good and let the bad go. In terms of what's in your past. Yeah.
Right. And one of the things I wanted to mention, Michael, and you and I talked a little bit about this before we went on, but the word deconstruction is very fashionable today. It's mostly for people who deconstruct themselves out of Christianity. That's, you've got the ex-evangelical movement, as they call themselves, the ex-evangelical movement, and others who have abandoned the faith for whatever reasons. And that's usually where we hear about this word deconstruction. But I want to say two things for us to kind of get into this discussion. The first is people don't just deconstruct out of religion. People deconstruct into it. The most famous example that I think we can think of here is C.S. Lewis, who was an atheist and who deconstructed himself out of atheism by thinking, reflecting, and became a Christian. And so that's the first thing. So we'll talk about that in a minute. The other thing is deconstruction is it's not a deeply profound concept. People deconstruct all the time. We've been deconstructing throughout history, right? So let's take the first one, Michael. So, to deconstruct, it doesn't mean that there is some profound truth that now I have found and I reject, and everybody else should reject it too, because my experience tells me that. Someone can deconstruct in a different direction.
Yeah. Well, one of the things you said, we've been doing this for a long time. The first thing that came to my mind is the opening of the Bible, Genesis 1. The biblical studies that I've read suggest that Genesis 1 is in many ways a response to the surrounding cultures, the cosmology of the surrounding cultures, with God's creating people to be their slaves, and they're these, what's the word I'm looking for? Frivolous beings who destroy people and destroy worlds and create chaos and so on. And the Bible in Genesis 1 tells the story where there's sort of three separate realms of existence. God creates everything that's in those realms, that God is in charge of it all, and that God then places humanity as God's image bearer, the highest of the creatures that's created, that is a place of honor and cooperation and relationship with God. That's deconstructing the narratives of the people around you. So right out the gate of the Bible is the story of deconstruction of what's around. So yeah, deconstruction to me just seems to flow in so many different directions. I think one of the things that you mentioned there a second ago that I was thinking about was back in the emergent church movement, when that was a big thing 15, 20, 25 years ago, when that was all developing. I went to a couple of weekend long events for emergent church and attended various gatherings, conferences, that types of things. One of the things that I kept coming to over and over again, coming at this from a mainline perspective. Now, I grew up Church of Nazarene. That's as a young adult. Became a Presbyterian as a young adult, 22, 23 years old. But most of my adult life had been in the mainline church. And when I would go to these emergent events, overwhelmingly, these were people that were evangelical, who had come out of the evangelical tradition. And yet all I kept hearing was, it seemed like rather than trying to find a new vision of to be the church, their whole mission became to be contra evangelical.
Yeah.
All right. So anything evangelicals did, we need to oppose that and not do that, which is to still be defined by evangelicalism.
Right.
And to the degree that they were finding new things, the new things that they were finding were the things, the beliefs, the speakers, the authors, the theologians. They were all the things that the mainline people have been looking to for decades. That was the new stuff that they were finding. Now, I suspect part of that's probably true for any of us, when particularly if we feel conflicted or we feel harmed in some way by what's in our past, that there's probably a knee-jerk reaction to try to react against that. But at some point, that deconstruction has to lead to the construction of something new that incorporates the good, gets rid of the bad of the things that we've had in the past. So anyway,
listen, when you say that, I am reminded of I grew up in evangelicalism. I wasn't Nazarene, but I grew up in evangelicalism. And one of the things that we were taught as Protestant evangelicals was that Catholics are not Christians.
Right.
They believe in salvation by works, they worship Mary, they pray to the saints, all this stuff. In fact, I'll tell you a quick story. I remember when I was maybe 10 or 11 years old, I played Little League Baseball. And one of the things we had to do at the beginning of every season is we had to do some fundraising. So one Saturday morning, all the teams in the league, we all dressed up in our uniforms and we went from house to house, two at a time, to try and drum up some money, and we give them a little decal and all of that. So I'm with a fellow teammate. And so we just started talking as we were walking between houses, and he asked me, so all of a sudden he just came right out and he said, he asked me, "What religion are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm a Christian." And I said, "What religion?" Oh, no. He asked me what church I went to. And I said, I told him what church I went to. And then I said, "What church do you go to?" And he mentioned a Catholic church in the area. And I looked at him and said, as sincerely as I could, "I thought you said you were a Christian." See, I mean, so over time, what happened to me, thankfully, is I was able to deconstruct that view into something that was more complex. One of the things I think, Michael, that deconstruction does for us, regardless of what we're deconstructing out of, what good deconstruction should do for us is help us to see a more complicated, nuanced picture of reality.
Yes, right.
Right. So if you, like you use the emergent church example, if you deconstruct out of something and then you just define yourself by what you no longer are, that is really not what I would call a healthy deconstruction.
Exactly. Right. Yep.
And I, so I then had to reconstruct, well, what do I think about the Christian faith that helps me to understand that Christianity not only includes my evangelical Protestant context, but also includes Catholics and Presbyterians and others. And so now you are reconstructing something, but it's much more nuanced. It's more complicated. And see, this is where I think deconstructionists, so let me tell you my story that I relate to you. Maybe a month or so ago, I was online and I posted something on social media in which I basically said, I would not know how to live my life as a follower of Jesus if it were not for the wisdom of the church, something like that. Basically, what I was trying to say was who I am as a follower of Jesus. If there's anything positive about my life that reflects Jesus, I did not come up with that by myself. It's because of the wisdom of the church, the wisdom of people I have known personally, and the wisdom of the people through the ages, right through the centuries.
Right.
I mean, I got just nailed by some ex people who have deconstructed themselves out of the faith. I had one person who has deconstructed themselves out of evangelicalism, told me my comment was laughable. I had another person who is no longer in the faith, was a pastor at one time, and who basically said that my problem was that I lacked critical self-reflection and I was afraid to dig deeply into myself to see why, and so here's the perfect example of what I'm going to call deconstructive fundamentalism, that I do not deny that these people have had a bad experience. I mean, you and I, Michael, we know the church. We know that there are abusive pastors out there. We know that there are emotionally unhealthy churches out there. And we know that people have been hurt and abused. I do not dismiss that abuse. I do not dismiss their story. In fact, I grieve, because as one who thinks the church is the new creation God has planned for the world, I grieve when we have not lived up to that. But then to be turned around and told that my experience, because their experience wasn't my experience, it's different, that their experience is somehow the standard. And my overall positive experience of the church throughout my life is somehow less than true. So the one thing that has to happen in deconstruction, again, is to understand that life is more nuanced and complex, and that you and I and everybody we know, we all are storied people. We have different stories. Those stories come together. Sometimes those stories are clash, whatever. But there needs to be something. There needs to be. I mean, I don't know what to say other than maybe you need to get to the place where in your deconstruction you're looking at things a little more maturely. Now that I've talked a lot here. I mean, what are your thoughts?
Well, one of the things I'm thinking about as you're talking about all this is that it seems to me the process of deconstruction, if you've had to deconstruct something, legitimately deconstruct something that you believed in, that means you once held that view sincerely and you no longer do. All right. So that means if that happens to me, then that means I wasn't perfect in my perception and understanding of things, and I had to learn something new. So should not my response be to other people who maybe don't have it quite right and have figured out, is maybe a little bit of humility, because I didn't have it right once as well. And so this idea of browbeating people and mocking and ridiculing people that have not come to the same deconstructive point that you have not landed in the same place, are you not just repeating what you deconstructed, which is a sort of a closed-minded arrogance to things. I think we mentioned this in an earlier video that I've looked it up. It was Kenneth Bailey that I heard one time talks about holding his theology with a tentative finality. And the idea is that we can't go through life not holding a position and not deciding on things. We have to make decisions. And those decisions have to be made on assessments of something about what the truth is and how things work. But we can hold that tentatively, being open with our minds and our eyes open for new information, for learning about how things might change. And that requires some humility to do that.
Yeah.
And so a lot of these people that I see that are often abusive and critical of people who haven't come to their same deconstructive point, I think are still living in response and reaction to what they left. They have not come to a new understanding of what the truth is my
yeah, and I want to give those people space, because I know that some of those people have been hurt, and they've been wounded deeply, and these wounds do not just heal overnight. So I want to allow for that, but I want them in the midst of their hurt to understand that not all have experienced what they've experienced. Just like, Michael, one of the things that's a real good remedy for all of this is the willingness to have conversation and listen to other people's stories. And I mean, really listen. I don't mean to dismiss or undermine people's stories. So for example, here's one thing. Let's go back to the person who has deconstructed themselves out of Christianity because they have been in an abusive church situation.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm truly listening to this person share their story with me, a unacceptable response in listening is to say, well, not all churches are like that.
Yeah.
Because what you're doing is you are dismissing it. You're saying you don't mean to do it. You want, in my desire to defend the church in general, what I'm doing is saying, yeah, you had that experience, but you realize that you're kind of unique. Well, the answer is no, they're not unique. Unfortunately, they're not unique. And so we need to be willing to listen to the stories of others, hear those stories, and accept them as as valid, and not be so quick to respond because their story has made me, who remains a believer, uncomfortable.
Right. Yes. And asking questions. Listening and asking questions rather than making declarative statements about what is and isn't. I think when dealing in those situations, I was on a board several years ago. We had a guy who was a police officer on the board. He often didn't say much at board meetings, but I picked up on a pattern of his every now and then. When it seemed like the group was getting a little ratcheted up, there was some emotional tension going on between people, he would sometimes interrupt, and he would not deal with the facts of what was there, but he would ask the question something to this effect. He says, okay, so let's assume that such and such happens. What is at stake if that happens? And then what you get at is that people are often arguing for or against facts based on their fear of what they think the consequences will be without stating what the consequences are of what's happening. Yeah. And to be able to say, okay, so if I did believe that, what are the consequences of believing that, or what are the consequences of acting on that? And getting people to articulate the emotional side of what is driving, and to be able to have conversations on those. So often we try to retreat to the logical and the pragmatic side of things, and many times what's driving us is our emotional distress and our emotional upset. And that's where I think only listening and asking questions, that's the only way that conversation can happen.
Yeah, it's like the funny conversation where the guy says, he says, I believe most people, if you present them with the facts, will make reasonable decisions very logically. And his buddy he's talking with says, well, actually, psychologists say that most of our decisions are made emotionally. And the guy doesn't know what to say, and he says, well, that's just what I believe. Right? And that, I always want to be careful on that, because I don't want to separate reason and rationality from our emotions. But your point is well taken. And that sometimes what happens, these responses are out of our emotion, and that's not bad. Our emotions are emotion. I mean, psychology 101 says your feelings are your feelings. Right. I might not understand them, but they're your feelings. Right. And so, the dumbest thing for me to say is, Michael, you really shouldn't feel that way.
Yeah.
right? Because
Right.
you do.
Right.
And
Right.
yeah, let's talk a little bit. You mentioned Genesis and deconstruction. Let's talk a little bit about some other scripture. One of the things that's very clear in the Gospels is that uh, Jesus, frankly, his whole ministry with his disciples is deconstructing their understanding of the Messiah. Right?
Boy.
I mean, the Messiah
Yeah.
is going to come and he's going to amass the army. He's going to throw the Romans out and
Right.
bring in the reign of God, and put Israel back in control of its own destiny. And the whole 3 years is nothing but deconstruction. I mean,
Right.
he tells Peter, Peter uh, confesses him as Christ, and then Jesus starts to say what that means is, dying, being beaten, abused, rejected, dying, and everything. And of course, Peter
Right.
takes him aside to give him Messiah lessons, and Jesus's response is pretty terse to him, and the death and then the resurrection of Jesus. Their whole understanding of messiahship, before it can be constructed into
Right.
their beliefs about Jesus and the gospel they preach, their beliefs in Messiah have to be deconstructed. And Jesus does that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And
But
go
I
ahead.
was, yeah, I was just reading recently. It was I think it's the story about where Jesus responds with a parable about the great banquet, and he invites all the people, and people decide not to show up at the last second. So then he goes out to the highways and byways and bring in everybody else. And I think the story that prompts that is the Jews, the Sadducees, the Pharisees are testing Jesus again. They ask who's going to be at this banquet. My understanding is that they're referring to a passage in Isaiah that talks about this great banquet where God calls all the people of the earth to this great banquet. But during Second Temple Judaism, in the supplemental writings, the Jews had developed this whole idea that there's going to be this great banquet, and now the Gentiles were going to show up. But once they got there, God was going to execute them all right there and establish Israel, and that was going to be, how we were going to do this. And so that's what they're all believing, is they're asking this question and they're testing to see what Jesus says. And Jesus says, you guys are the ones who aren't going to, you're the ones going to get kicked out. It's going to be the Gentiles that are going to be, I mean, that is deconstruction of what's going on. And you see over almost every parable he tells is deconstructing something that the audience believes. Yeah.
He does that with his sermon in Nazareth when he reads from the scroll of Isaiah, and basically what he says, and the gist of his sermon is that now the kingdom is coming, and by the way, it doesn't look the way you thought it was going to look.
Right.
And that, of course, also provokes an angry response. What a great invitation, Michael! Come to the great banquet. Come for the food. Stay for the bloodletting. And
that's right. Yeah, exactly. Right? Yes, right. Yeah.
Yeah, and so this is all deconstruction. By the way, let me give another obvious example from the New Testament is Paul on the Damascus Road. He's convinced as a good Pharisee, and he's got his scripture to back it up as to why Jesus is not the Messiah. And and basically he meets Jesus on the Damascus Road, and he gets deconstructed.
Yeah.
And so then the conundrum that faces Saul is, if indeed Jesus has been raised from the dead, I've been reading it incorrectly. I've been reading it wrong.
Yeah.
And so I would argue that what you see particularly in Romans and Galatians is Paul's reconstruction of what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah.
Right.
So he gets deconstructed in a dramatic way. I'll tell you what, let me say this, Michael. It seems to me when you read the Bible, God is not afraid of stepping all over our stories.
Right.
He's not afraid of stepping on, because often stories are mythologies that we make, right? I mean, and God's not afraid of stepping on our stories and saying, that's not the way it works.
Right.
So I don't know that we need to be afraid of deconstruction. I think particularly if we believe that all truth is God's truth, and asking questions is a good thing, even if those questions lead people in other directions. I mean, I don't know how we can captivate other people's consciences.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking the other day about the word disillusioned.
Yeah.
And we think of the word disillusioned as a negative word, as a negative context, meaning something bad has happened because we've become disillusioned. Does that mean that the preferable way is to live is with illusions? You talk about being disillusioned.
Yeah.
The process of deconstruction is often a process of being disillusioned
Yeah.
with something, because you realize that it's more complicated, it's more difficult than it's there, and that rightfully is sometimes painful and disorienting in terms
Right.
of how it happens. And I think that that's another piece of it too, in conversation, when people are talking about deconstructing things, particularly somebody who wants to have somebody else deconstruct their perspective. If your entire agenda is to show that the other person's construction is wrong, and that's it, but the piece that needs to be missing in legitimate deconstruction needs to be, okay, let's have this conversation about what is not valid, what is not correct, but there also needs to be a sense of grace and offering something that is
Yes.
that is the new thing, that then replaces or supplements what has been misunderstood or what's been missing. And so often these discussions seem to me about people just wanting to win arguments as opposed to seeking wholesome, shalom-filled transformation
Yes.
for others and for ourselves.
Yes. Yes,
yeah.
That's a good segue into what I do want to talk about, because I don't think we can end this conversation without talking about what is it that we do after deconstructing. That I'm a Christian, you're a Christian. I tell people I'm a follower of Jesus for two reasons. First and centrally, I believe that Jesus has been bodily raised from the dead, and I use the word bodily because, contrary to some of my Methodist friends, if the
Right.
resurrection of Jesus is just a metaphor or a symbol, Michael, we're hosed.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And if Jesus has been bodily raised, something's different here.
Right.
And the second reason is that I just think Christianity makes best sense of the world. So I want to commend that to others, but I can't commend it, first of all, unless people are open to hearing why I'm a Christian.
Right.
You can't force it on people. But the other thing is, how do I even have conversation with somebody? How do you even get to the place where two people who believe differently can share their stories,
Right.
let me say it this way. How is it that two people can get to the place where they can commend their stories to each
Right.
other
Right.
until we have each been willing to listen to the other story
Right.
and not
Right.
be so quick to respond in order to, as you say, win the argument, because
Right.
that's not the point.
Right. I mean, it's almost cliche now, but the phrase about nobody cares what you have to say until they know that you care. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the cliche version of it, but there has to be that sense of relationship and sense of trust. And I would even add, I guess, as another nuance to this as well too, because I think if each of us are doing our faith right, we are probably undergoing a perpetual sense of deconstruction as we
Yeah.
go along. And I think it's okay in many circumstances as we're having conversations. I think a legitimate answer sometimes to some of the questions we have is, I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. I'm looking myself, and I'm not sure I know exactly what the answer is. And again, it just comes back to a sense of humility of, are we genuinely looking for truth and how to become more wholly grounded in the truth? Or are we just looking to win arguments? I really think that that's where a big piece of the whole deconstruction thing comes in. And I think that's where some people get reactive against people who are talking about deconstruction, is because many times, I didn't say many times, sometimes people that are talking about their deconstruction are often doing it antagonistically towards anybody who disagrees with them. And I think that's where the problem comes. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. So let me tell you a quick story. I don't know that I've related this story in a past episode, but about maybe 4 years ago, I was preaching on one Sunday, and I no longer remember what I was preaching on, or the text. But I raised an uncomfortable, I raised a difficult question near the end of my sermon. And I responded, as I was speaking to the congregation, I raised a question and I said, I don't really know the answer to that question.
Yeah.
And
Right.
about 2 days later, I think it was a text message from a young man who came, who didn't come to church a lot. His mother was fairly active, but he was a young man in his 20s, and he had actually kind of deconstructed himself into being an agnostic.
Right.
But he came to church this one Sunday and he heard me say that, and he sent me a text message and he says, "Can we get together?" I said, "Sure, we can get together over coffee and talk." So we did. And he said that he told me, he said, "The reason I wanted to talk to you was you're the first pastor I've ever heard say he doesn't know something."
Yeah. Right.
He
Yeah.
says, every every pastor I talk to always seems to have an answer.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I kept thinking, I do think there's a temptation for us who lead the church in particular that when people come with perplexing questions, we almost feel like we have to have an answer where we really
Right.
don't, that it's okay
Right.
to say, I don't know the answer to that. And in fact, the more I study things and read and the older I get, there are things that I used to be certain of, I'm no longer certain of.
Right.
Mike, you hit a certain age where you just say to yourself, well, I figure that God's going to work that out somehow.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So the other factor here for all involved, regardless of where we are, is a little humility on our part for all of us to
Yeah.
be humble enough, you know.
Well, one of my favorite lines from A Christmas Carol, my Alistair Sim version of Christmas Carol, 1951 or whenever it was that was made. There's just this wonderful scene where he's had his epiphany and he's celebrating the fact that he's back among the living and everything. And he says, "I don't know anything. I never did know anything, but now I know that I don't know anything."
That's right.
I mean, that's really kind of what
That's right.
that's what that discovery is about,
Yeah.
and just being humble about that with others in conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, there is. I think there's a Peanuts cartoon where Lucy says to Linus, "It takes a long time to understand nothing."
Yeah. Right. That's right. Yeah.
So I am, I am okay with the questions. I am okay with the seeking. That's one of the reasons all my social media stuff is called Faith Seeking Understanding. I think it's okay to be seekers. And while I wish people would come to other conclusions than they sometimes do,
Right.
I have to be content with the freedom for them to do that.
Right. Right.
And be comfortable with that. That sometimes I think, Michael, that when someone else has a different experience of us, of faith or anything else for that matter, that I found this out as a pastor, where I would run into people that if they had an opinion that I didn't agree with, that said something negative about them and their opinion, because I was the pastor.
Okay.
So I can remember one time a parishioner came in to see me. This was a long time ago in another church many years ago. She wanted to know my position on a certain issue, and I told her, and it was not the position she had, and she's really upset about this, as if because I'm the pastor, her position was, I was raising, it was less valid or something. And so I finally had to remind her. I said, I don't know what you're getting upset about. You're the one that came in and asked me. I didn't volunteer the information. You wanted to know what I thought, and I'm glad to be honest. And here's what I thought. But I think sometimes we react like we do because underneath, we don't admit this, but underneath, someone who I respect and someone's position matters to me, I sometimes can be reactive because that doesn't validate me. That's what confirmation is all about, bias is all about, right?
Right.
I'm going to watch and listen to and read only those things that confirm what I already believe, because I don't want to have to engage the possibility that I just might be wrong.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Exactly.
All right. Well, I think we're probably about time, Michael. Do you have any words of reconstruction as we prepare to leave this? Any thoughts? Any final thoughts?
Well, I think as I get older and older, the thing that comes more and more true to me is that through Scripture and through the church, that God has revealed something of God's self to us. But what becomes more and more real to me is how much bigger and how much more God is than what God has revealed to us. There is so much that we don't know about who God is and what God's purposes are, and all the details that are going on. We have that which is sufficient for us to know at this time. And to just have a little humility about
Yeah.
how God works, and have a little more compassion and respect for each other as we go about the journey. That's one of the things I keep coming to as I get older. So life is a series of deconstructions for anybody who I think is taking their faith seriously, and people should not be anxious about the fact that they find themselves in a deconstructing mode, and should not be ridiculed. And if you have deconstructed, belittling and berating people who haven't come to the same place that you came to, I think that means your deconstruction isn't complete yet.
Right. And to
yeah.
yes, and for Christians to be the kind of people where folks can feel comfortable coming to have conversation about this. Sometimes I find that Christians are the worst when it comes to willing to engage different perspectives, even if the perspectives, are out of quote unquote what they've accepted as Christian. That
Right.
we don't want to have to engage that. And I just think that if, again, as a Christian, if I believe all truth is God's truth, then I need to be willing to engage whomever is reflecting on what is true, whether it's something I agree with or whether it's something that makes me uncomfortable or not.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Yeah.
Okay. All right, Michael. Well, thank you again, as always.
Yeah. Good
And
conversation.
yeah, it was a good conversation. So, friends, thanks for joining us. And I am Allan Bevere, your host of Faith Seeking Understanding. And the patron saint of Faith Seeking Understanding is Anselm of Canterbury, who said, I do not understand in order to believe, but I believe in order to understand. Friends, keep seeking.